Can you define the difference between brand marketing and brand advertising?
Your brand strategy is just this much more holistic approach to how you want your brand to show up with your audience. And brand advertising is basically the use of paid media to try and communicate your brand to a particular target audience.
What are some of those things that just make like the growth marketer hairs on the back of your neck be like, crap, I've got to like diversify my spend, or I've got to do something different?
I used to do this actually at Netflix a lot, where you would just have a spend curve, and essentially once you factor in kind of like seasonality against a spend curve on a per channel basis, you can then start to get a sense for, okay, well, how much more room does this channel have left?
Welcome to Growth Talks, where we dive deep into the world of growth and marketing with industry leaders. I'm Krystina Rubino, your host and the general manager of the offline practice at Right Side Up. Today, I'm excited to chat with Patrick Moran, who is currently leading growth marketing efforts at Robinhood. Patrick is a marketing advisor and has held leadership roles at consumer companies like Netflix, Spotify, and Yik Yak. He spent time as an executive in residence at Reforge, where he led the growth marketing, brand marketing, and experimentation programs. And he was also the producer and host of a marketing podcast called Finding Market Fit. In this episode, we're going to get into the role of storytelling in growth marketing and the importance of marrying data and brand.
Thanks for having me. Very excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to get right into it. I love this topic so much. And I think there's so much that we don't talk about when it comes to the like tension between growth marketing and brand advertising. But you have often talked about how marrying both data and storytelling is actually how you achieve success in our business, right? And you've made a point around brand advertising and how that has to play an important role in overall growth strategy. So to start us off, just for everybody watching or listening, can you define the difference between brand marketing and brand advertising?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's one of the mistakes that most people make, right? Whenever they're saying, okay, well, should we invest in brand or performance? And really, they're trying to use sort of a performance lens onto, brand advertising. When the reality is, brand advertising is usually just one component of a brand strategy holistically. So, brand marketing, maybe I'll talk about brand strategy just in general. Maybe just because once we start to get into brand marketing, it becomes a little bit more nebulous from that standpoint. But Joanna Lord, who is the CMO of Spring Health, so she came from Reforged, and she actually wrote an article about this and talked about brand strategy for startups. And essentially what she says is that there's a couple of components to brand strategy, right? There's the actual development of it. What's your tone, what's your voice, what's your mission, your vision, and things like that, which are basically the inputs that just ensure that there's alignment across the board between marketing, product, customer service, sales, and what have you, right? And so that there's just this level of consistency, and the roadmaps are all, fairly aligned. Then there's the level of execution against this. So the level of execution is, okay, well, what's your tone? What's your positioning? How do you want to show up to the market and things like that? And then there's another component of it. Well, there's two more. The last one is around sort of how does this fit the overall, I guess, approach? How do you want to show up into the world? But the one component I think where sort of advertising starts to fit in is in the distribution. And there's many different ways to distribute it, right? There's many different ways to distribute and communicate your brand. And one of them is media. And so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to completely use your performance perspectives on it, which typically have a much shorter look back period than sort of your brand advertising, and then employ it there, just because then the goals are different, right? So generally speaking, your brand strategy is just this much more holistic approach to how you want your brand to show up with your audience. And brand advertising is basically the use of paid media to try and communicate your brand to a particular target audience. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a completely new audience. It can be an existing user audience. But that's usually the difference.
So it's interesting in less charitable things than I've heard when people are talking about like brand marketing and brand strategy and the application of that to paid media. There's an old joke in our business that it's like, well, if you had a sans serif font and a Facebook advertising budget for a little while there, you had a brand, right? What's really interesting to me about the marketing environment that we find ourselves in now, kind of like after the reckoning of the last couple of years, where as an industry, we stopped prioritizing growth at all costs. We started prioritizing efficiency and true performance. How do you see the concepts of brand advertising, brand marketing, brand strategy playing out in like today's growth marketing environment?
It depends. So, I mean, I think there's a couple components to it. So let me dive into I guess just how we think about performance marketing, and then I'll talk about like how at least I've learned from other amazing sort of marketing leaders on how they approach brand, and it's not necessarily limited to just spending on paid media. But generally speaking, for performance marketing, right, there is a component of I mean, performance marketing, you're still shelling out creatives, right? You still have creatives that hit the market, and there's certain situations where your unit economics would actually work out even if you're using quote unquote you know non-traditional performance media channels like TV or like out of home or using sort of like what some type of digital takeover, right? The unit economics might still work out. And so by definition, you're actually optimizing towards performance marketing metrics, right? Going at it, I guess from that standpoint, I think for the most part, that's where you can't really sort of divorce the brand impact with performance simply because whatever it is that you're shelling out in performance advertising is still hitting a market, right? And the audience on the other side of that doesn't care whether that's coming from your performance marketing team or your brand marketing team. They just care that it's coming from this one brand. They don't really care about your org structure, right?
No, I'm just laughing because I'm just like, it is so true. Like, as marketers, we get so hung up on these definitions and these silos in a sense. And it's just like, dude, if it's good creative, people don't know. Consumers don't know precisely in the context, like which bucket the money comes out of, right? Like, and good growth marketing should build your brand, and good brand advertising should perform and drive people kind of down your funnel. So it's just it's a seesaw in a way, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess like tactically speaking, right? If you just take a step back, tactically speaking, the most classic performance marketing channels, specifically Google and Facebook, and to some level programmatic advertising, if you look at their algorithms and you look at how they're bringing you users, they're essentially scouring their entire network using the signals that they have to give you users or customers that are already in market for something that you offer, right? Which is by definition why you call it demand collection, right? And for the most part, that's why you have much stricter look back periods, right? Not payback periods. I mean, payback periods is a different sort of situation, but you have much stricter look back periods. For consumer, it's typically 24 hours to 7 days. For B2B, it could be 24 hours. I mean, it could be 7 days or 30 days, but there's a look back period. And look back period is there because you have some level of confidence that whatever it is that you're offering, these publishers are able to get enough signal to bring you those users. Now, the problem there is that at some point that starts to hit diminishing returns. And the reason why that hits diminishing returns is because there's a competitive dynamic that's out in the market that's also trying to reach the audience that you're trying to reach. And so, from that standpoint, that's where you have to start to differentiate yourself. And there are many ways to differentiate yourself. One of them is brand advertising, and that's where a lot of companies would go outside of these traditional two channels and actually start to try and stir up what we call demand generation, right? And so from that standpoint, the I guess the partnership then is that you're able to stimulate some level of demand so that Google and Facebook can pick that up and then eventually pass that on to your users who you're optimizing against. The problem here is that it takes some level of sophistication to measure all of that, which is why most people will always tell you to just run a match market test. And now we can get into the 3 to 4 different ways to run match market tests, whether you want to run a persistent holdout or 10% holdout on a much more sort of batch basis and what have you. But that's why, you know, that's why these things are always happening. That's why there are a lot of conversations around the basically the marriage between these types of advertising mechanisms, the goals, the strategies, along with how you measure them and actually gain confidence that what you're doing is actually working.
One of my favorite marketing challenges, and I'm no longer agency side, but this was a perennial challenge when I was working in paid search, was how do we make our brand search go up? And it's like, okay, Well, I do not have there's a pencil, not a magic wand. If I had a magic wand to make brand search go up, I would have done it already and I would be very rich on an island somewhere. It'd be great. What's really interesting is that the only real way to make brand search go up or to generate essentially more demand and more interest around your brand is to have brand advertising influence brand search, customer acquisition strategies. And like when you're thinking about businesses where you might be at a different stage or you might have higher LTV versus lower LTV. How do you think about the balance and tension of the different levers that you can pull? Because to your point, all of the traditional growth marketing channels are capturing demand. And at a certain point, your pool is going to be very shallow and you're going to continue talking to people that you've already talked to, right? And that's the diminishing returns part. That or it just gets too competitive in your category, whatever. How does brand advertising influence brand search and customer acquisition strategies? And particularly like if you've got any examples of like high or low LTV, but just thinking about how all of these things work in concert.
I guess the way that we're thinking about branded search or brand search at this point, and I'm assuming we're talking about both organic and paid, right? So basically, just or holistically, brand search
Yeah, search engine marketing overall, but branded versus, non-branded or category terms.
is basically a proxy for the demand that your brand is sort of eliciting, right? That's kind of what we're assuming at this point. And I think the other thing maybe to consider in this situation is that, again, advertising is only one component of the distribution or communication like methods to get there, right? So there are other ways to do that depending on the type of company that you are and the type of sort of distribution that you typically employ, right? So more often than not, most if not all companies at certain stages have different have comms teams, right? So that's a driver. But then if you look at other companies, right? So you look at, let's say, Duolingo, right? So Duolingo actually does not spend on brand advertising, but they do a lot of brand, and they usually go through kind of like their organic social and some of their partnerships. If you look at a company like Ipsy, which is a D2C makeup company, they go through their influencers, right? And if you look at a company like Notion or even like HubSpot earlier, like early days HubSpot, a lot of it is content driven, right? And so I guess one way to think about it is that brand advertising is one component of the various ways to drive distribution in order to impact your branded search. And from that standpoint, there are various ways to measure that, right? But specifically around brand advertising and branded search and how that impacts things. The other important thing, I guess, for brand advertising, or which is really, I mean, another way to think about kind of like, an approach on using various forms of media to try and drive some level of conversion, which is usually acquisition. That will always have some level of halo effect, and that's why it's always sort of important to figure out the right measurement approach to your multimedia campaigns, because I don't know, or I have at least not yet seen one method, like one solo method, that'll basically be able to answer your questions, right? Specifically, let's say around branded search or any of the sort of the other halo effects that these campaigns will typically drive. So usually from that standpoint, I'll probably rely on an MMM, right? Which essentially correlates spend and conversion data and a whole host of other sort of factors. So I'll rely on that on a much more sort of kind of like on an ongoing basis. And then I'll rely on sort of match market tests to essentially tune the MMM and provide a triangulation point against that. And then the third thing, which is kind of like what you were alluding to a little bit earlier, is then I would also start to rely on qualitative data or qualitative information around what people are saying, right? So this is where you sort of have, exposed versus not exposed, and then you do lift tests against them, and then you see, right? But the thing is, I think the trick there is that I think that most of the mistakes that most companies make in this situation, or what they used to make in this situation, is that they'll only look at the qualitative brand lift studies. Well, I have not yet seen a brand lift study that has been negative. I have never seen a brand lift study that was negative. I've been looking at brand lift studies for 15 years at this point. I have not seen any of them that have been negative. They've always been some type of positive. Now, the question is to what level of positive, right? Is it plus 5 percentage points? Is it plus 10, plus 20? And then what drove it? Was it a particular sort of media, when and where, et cetera, right? But if you take that alone, of course finance is going to be like, well, what does this mean? Right? Like, you gave me, sort of a brand lift study, there's no context around it. All right, so you would have to sort of marry it with some other areas of measurement, and then that's how you eventually get to, okay, well, how does this impact brand search and every other sort of halo effect that hopefully that you're looking to gather as well.
I gotta tell you, the I've never seen a brand lift study come back negative. Without knowing it, you stole one of my like perpetual lines. I say it all the time, and I wish I were. It's like, oh my god, you mean advertising works? No way! You mean there's a reason that people pay us to do this job, and that once people see an advertisement about something they're interested in, they take an action? Holy crap! Like it is. I really like the treatment though of like, yes, there's going to be some sort of a lift, right? But the other thing that I've never seen is I've never really seen a brand lift study that I've used to make a substantial change in how I am allocating my marketing dollars, or even not just between channels but between publishers also. Like, it's extraordinarily hard to get a read down to that very granular level of like not only what channels are working but what tactics are working. And that's where I think MMM comes in. But without the rest of this context, it's really hard. And just from your own experiences, talking kind of about the way that you can hit diminishing returns and demand capturing channels, what are some of the signs that you start to see where you kind of like, what we do is an art and a science, right? So like, what are some of those things that just make like the growth marketer hairs on the back of your neck be like, crap, I've got to like diversify my spend, or I've got to do something different, or like I am coming to the shallow end of this pool and I'm going to run out of water soon?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that an MMM would be able to provide you with, and actually it doesn't, you don't even need an MMM. I think we used to do this actually at Netflix a lot, where you would just have a spend curve. And essentially, once you factor in kind of like seasonality against a spend curve on a per channel basis, you can then start to get a sense for, okay, well, how much more room does this channel have left relative to all the other channels, right? And the baseline is all the other channels because it's hard to use seasonality as a baseline because the product is inherently getting better, right? I mean, the product roadmap is there simply because it's meant to sort of drive up LTV, right? So generally speaking, I think once you start to get a sense of, okay, well, let's spend, incrementally more, spend incrementally more, spend incrementally more, and then you start to hit, you start to kind of like flatline, but not yet at that point. You can then start to see, okay, well, we can maybe see a 10% improvement in this one, maybe a 15% improvement, given campaign optimization changes or creative optimization changes or things like that. But we're not going to see 2x, 3x, or 4x level improvements simply because at that point, like we've already hit, kind of like diminishing returns. The only other, not the only, but the other way to actually start to slice this out is by slicing out your LTV cohorts. So the one problem or the one challenge I think that a lot of companies typically run into is they use one LTV as an average for all their users, right? And so once you are able to start to split that out into maybe 3, 4, 5 different cohorts, then you're basically now introducing kind of like a whole new set of capabilities at the channel level, and then you're able to then sort of start to split out your spend curve. So the companies actually that do this really well are e-commerce companies because they're able to they just inherently have different categories for their SKUs. The challenge with e-commerce companies though is that they're now trying to balance between optimizing for the SKUs versus optimizing for acquisition in general, right? That's usually kind of, but generally speaking, I think for a lot of consumer companies and maybe even for B2B companies, there's just a lot of opportunity once you start to slice up the LTVs or LTV cohorts, and then you're able to then generate a whole new slew of spend curves relative to the channels.
Yeah. And then, I mean, basically, you're just playing with allowables at that point, right?
Yeah, at least from that standpoint, you're providing a lot more discipline to both volume and ROI profile, right? So, okay, well, there are certain times where, okay, well, I'm going to focus a little bit more on the ROI profile, or even kind of like the revenue profile, as opposed to volume, and vice versa. That's where, you start to play around. And that's, I mean, going back to your question around brand, that's kind of like, if you look at companies like Wayfair, right? So like for Wayfair, they have, I don't know, 4 or 5 different brands like within their umbrella brand, and they'll spend maybe, they'll spend their money on their highest, like their the showroom brand, and then they'll go all out performance on kind of like everything else, right? So
It just paints the picture for like, well, if there's such a tried and true path to growing, right? Wouldn't we all just be following the same playbook and like rinse and repeat running it again? Right. And I find that when you work at different companies and in different categories, like the balance of this is just so individualized for each brand that you work with and each category that you work in.
I think so. I mean, I guess on the consumer side, maybe even on the B2B side, it depends on how many steps back you want to take. Because I think if you take enough steps back, you can then sort of look into like programs like Reforge that do have like frameworks around growth, both on the acquisition side, the retention side, and the monetization side. And then, from there you kind of like customize it. But yeah, I mean, I think the one mistake, I guess, that that you certainly don't want to do is to make assumptions coming into a company that the motions and the levers for driving growth are exactly the same as the company that you were previously with.
Yeah. You can't just run it back.
No, and I mean there's to a certain degree we're looking at it at Spotify, because when I was at Spotify, we were like, well, we want to kind of build the same levers as Netflix did, right? And if you think about those two companies, they are fairly similar, like content, subscription product, entertainment, et cetera, et cetera. But once you dive deeper, you start to realize, okay, well, Netflix is at a different stage. The LTV CAC profile is different. The repeat usage and the behavioral engagements of somebody using Spotify on a mobile phone is different than somebody watching TV. And with Netflix, you can compete against 3 other players and still be fine. For Spotify, it's a winner take all situation. It's either you're using Spotify or you're not, right? So whereas you can be using Netflix and HBO and Amazon Prime and Disney, right? So I think there's frameworks, I guess, that you can use, but at some point you just have to be a little bit more customized to actually make it impact.
Yeah, I think frameworks is a good way. People always say playbooks, and I'm like, yeah, but a playbook, like you're going to run the same plays over and over again. You know what I mean? Like if a pick and roll worked the last time, it's and you have a good shot at warning it this time, and it's going to work. And like depending on the players that you have in the pick and roll, not to like get too into basketball, but like depending on the pieces that you're moving around, but it's almost like as you were talking through a framework, it's almost like a Lego set. Like you're gonna have the same pieces, right? If you get like a big box of Legos, but like somebody might make a flower with it and somebody else might make a race car. And it's the same pieces are there, but when you're putting them together and you're snapping them into place, it's like, oh, well, I want to put it into this place to make like this very specific thing. And one of the silly things that we do on this show is, and you're gonna laugh, but we have an A/B test because all we do is test, right? Like half of what we've already talked about is it always comes back to testing for growth marketers. We're always testing variables. And so I'm going to go fairly rapid fire, but some work related, some not, some fun, some nerdy. But yeah, you have to pick a winner because that's, there always has to be a winner of an A/B test.
Let's do it.
So long form or short form content?
I just choose which one.
Yeah.
Short form.
Why?
What is the success factor in this situation?
You're like, okay, what are the parameters of my experiment, Krystina? You are picking, if you had to choose one in whatever context you so desire, you are picking a favorite variable.
Okay. Well, yeah. Well, why short form? There's just less variables to play around with at that point. Long form, you just have a much longer sort of set of variables. Plus, yeah, short form, yeah, it's much more. It's much more contained within the testing environment, I guess.
Yeah, I like it. Coffee or tea?
Tea.
Board games or video games?
I'm going to say board games only because I like board games with other people and alcohol versus video games just feels like such an individualistic sort of set of exercises.
Yeah,
It's like, well, if that's the case, then I'll just go run outside. But yeah.
That's fair. AI created content or human created content?
Oh, there's no both.
No, you can't both variables can't win. One of them is going to be slightly
And so
better
this
than the other, or then we're getting into multivariate testing,
got
Patrick.
it. Yeah. So we're actually just testing. This is also just a preference sort of situation.
Absolutely, it's all preference. This
Got
is
it.
the least serious thing that either of us will do this
Yeah,
week.
as of right now, human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
All the content that I consume on Spotify and Netflix, as of now, the way that I understand it, for the most part, is all human driven. As far as I know.
As far as we know. It could be really, really good robot. You know what? Similar vein, but not really. User generated content or professionally produced content. Ah,
Yeah, let's go with professionally driven content. Professionally created
yeah.
content.
And that's just like any A/B test. There's no right answer. It's just whichever one happens to win at that point. TV shows or movies?
TV.
Apples or oranges?
Oranges.
Oh, oranges guy. Data-driven personalization or brand-driven storytelling?
Can I provide my answer and a caveat behind it? My answer to this one is data driven, is the data driven one for obvious reasons, because you could essentially take a brand driven narrative. You could take 3 different or 4 different brand driven narratives and then eventually sort of
And
gauge
you're
which one is
just
the best based off of data. The reason why I caveat that is because I've lived in too many environments which were too data driven and there was no brand and the brand ended up dying. So
mm-hmm.
you end up commoditizing yourself and there's no connection, right? There's no human connection.
No, it's almost like you're just holding up a mirror at that point. But in a very odd way. And then it could be any mirror, kind of. I don't know if that makes
You're
sense, but
basically a slave to what Facebook and Google's algorithms can provide you with.
yeah. And it's the old, like, if you don't stand for something, then what do you stand for? In-house team or traditional agency?
In-house team.
Running or yoga?
Running.
Listening to music or listening to podcasts?
That one is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Listening to podcasts by a very, very slim margin.
That's fair. Hey, sometimes there's a slim margin, right? One of the questions that I wanted to ask you earlier when we were getting into all of this is you've worked at different companies in different stages, and you've seen some companies navigate through different stages, right? I find that it's one of the variables that is so important when you're prioritizing your efforts. Like, what stage of the company are you at? At what point should a company start to balance between direct response, like performance marketing with a very, very tight LTV window, et cetera, and thinking more and investing more in brand building efforts?
So a company, regardless of their stage, even at their earliest stage, probably already think about their brand. I remember having a conversation with Ariel Jackson about this. And essentially, she basically said that your positioning statement is your product strategy, right? And so, I mean, if you think about it from that standpoint, your approach to who you are and who you are as a company and how you show up is something that probably is I mean, it's essentially something you should probably be aware of it at the very beginning. Now, insofar as like the more sort of traditional approach to that question, or I guess the meaning behind that question is around the investment amounts, right? So like, or when do you start to invest in quote unquote upper funnel type activities, driving some level of awareness versus, focusing on performance marketing? And I guess the answer to that question depends on a couple of things. One, are you economically sound to be able to do that? And so if you think about your unit economics from a paid standpoint, one of the most important things to look at is your payback period, right? So your LTV, you have your CAC, but then it's like, okay, well, am I getting paid back in 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, etc.? And so from that standpoint, if you are able to spend a certain amount and measure it to a certain degree with a level of confidence that it is impacting your LTV CAC within the right period, then by all means go for it. And usually companies are sort of painted into this corner because they're already getting commoditized or competition is starting to heat up, right? And you think about crypto, you think about healthcare, like you think about all these types of industries that just like, just popped up, or not popped up, but just started to explode over the last few years. It's very difficult, especially as you optimize for Facebook and Google, to actually start to differentiate yourselves, because Facebook and Google have essentially taken away the controls for you to actually bid at a very granular level, right? I mean, there's a reason why there is a UAC campaign, and that's because Google wants to decrease the barrier to entry for anybody to actually spend on their platform, without having to granularly go property by property and create specific campaigns to each of them, right? And Facebook does the same thing. And so that's why all these companies are now optimizing or buying inventory against programmatic, against TV, against podcasts, and things like that. So I would say, I guess the long answer to your question is maybe probably in the later stage when you have more cash and you have more money to basically absorb the risk that you're taking. But it's not just the amount of money that you want to spend towards working media. It's also the amount of time and resources that you have in developing the right measurement framework, having the right people test it, and having the right creatives land on it, right? So those are, I guess, some of the other areas that most companies just don't necessarily consider when they're like, oh, well, the unit economics might make sense and we can actually afford the working media. Well, that's great. Can you measure it, right? To a certain degree. And so I think that takes some time.
I love your point about the control that these companies have kind of taken away from marketers, because when you think about it, they're essentially broadening their own target pool, right? Like, we don't think of it that way because we don't like to think as marketers that we're navigating that kind of dynamic, but it truly is. Like, if you're starting in Google now, if you had to bid against people that have been bidding in this category and have such an advantage on you, they'd never have any new customers to acquire. I've never heard that point made that way, and I am so like nerded out right now on that. And actually, to the point about like when you start to invest in brand advertising, brand building, etc., when do you start to invest in more sophisticated measurement framework? Like, just when you're really just prioritizing spend on Meta and Google, you can get by for a minute just with their attribution methodologies. I do like to remind people all the time, I'm like, dude, like Facebook's still view through. Like, your direct CAC from Facebook is still modeled. It's still modeled. So make sure you're comparing it to the right things. But like, at what point should people start to think about, I need a more sophisticated marketing attribution framework, because if I just rely solely on Meta and Google, I'm going to get whatever false negative, false positive, inconclusive results, whatever.
I mean, by the way, there's also like other channels like email and push notifications, right? Which also in and of themselves sort of require their own kind of like measurement structures and frameworks and things like that, right? So, which is why, like, the investments to some of these things later on in the process just ends up adding up because, you're not just measuring paid, right?
You're borrowing on work. No, what's so you're borrowing on, basically you're borrowing against work that you've already done. And it's really, I think the part of this is, when do you flip from channel specific measurement only?
It depends on how much more scale and how much you're actually getting back from some of these channels, right? So, there are companies where they're just kind of living off of Google and or Facebook. And from that standpoint, it's not that difficult to do a pre-post and then use kind of like the attribution methods of these channels to then sort of triangulate the impact, right? Now, is it going to be super accurate? No, but is it going to be within a certain level of variance, or that gives you some level of confidence? Yes. Right. For as long as you're living in that world, I think it's totally fine to just kind of like live off of, kind of like their self-reported attribution, and or just start to build out your own attribution, whether it's some difference between last touch and first touch, or some amalgamation of MTA or what have you. And plus, not only that, but it's also just easier. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's easier to run match market tests if you're only running two channels, right? So I mean, I think there's also that component. But once you start to get to a point where, yes, I mean, now you're like, okay, well, you know what, we've tapped out on Facebook and Google, but we know that there's still a market for us out there, and we want to actually start to differentiate. And you've tested out some of these other channels, like podcasts and potentially TV or programmatic display or partnerships or whatever it is. Then at that point, I think then it starts to make sense to, okay, well, how do we want to measure this going forward, right? Because then at that point, you're not only just limiting yourself to strict performance marketing specific sort of situations. At that point, the assumption is that you can now start to toy around with much longer look back periods and then see how that impacts your performance marketing over time. And so from that standpoint, then it probably makes, if you're spending that level, then it probably makes sense to start to invest in like an MMM and things like that. The reason why I call out like email and push notifications is that there's an operational tax to actually ensuring that your data warehouse is in the right place figuring out that you have the right kind of like either reverse ETL or CDP that sits in the middle, and then you have like great reporting, right? And so all of these things I assume would have to be in place first before you start to go off and start to say, okay, well, actually, you know what? Now we need like a more sophisticated sort of measurement sort of framework and build out an MMM. And by the way, an MMM takes months to tune, if not years. So
I do like the idea though, or I appreciate the point of like it is relatively simpler to do match market testing when you have fewer channels to control as for variables. Because the most infuriating thing to me is when you wind up invalidating a marketing experiment because somebody off in another part of the organization was like, I'm going to spend a ton in New York that week. And you're like, no, please don't do that. Not that you'd ever choose New York as like an exposed audience realistically. Usually you try not to include the most one or two most expensive media markets in the country. But you know, it's you have these moments when you start to get bigger and many tentacles as an organization where you're like, oh crap, it's actually really hard to control variables.
yeah, I mean that, and then there are also other situations where maybe your channels are a little bit limited, but then your audiences are much more diverse, right? So if you think about, let's say, a marketplace, or you think about B2B, where you now have completely different audience profiles. And so you're now multiplying the number of channels that you have by the number of audiences or audience types that you have. So you could have a supplier, have a supply side, demand side sort of situation. You could have like an enterprise versus sort of like, very small business sort of situation. And so like piecing all of that together would probably require some level of sophistication. So I think once you start to get to that level, then it might make sense to actually start investing in a little bit more of a sophisticated sort of measurement framework outside of just straight attribution.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And you know, as we're drawing to a close here, you know, it's funny you mentioned B2B just now. Throughout your career though, you've primarily focused on D2C or B2C. What has kept you in B2C and what keeps you in B2C now?
B2B companies typically don't call me as much. I think that's probably one part of it. I don't know if that's going to be detrimental to my career over the course of time. But I guess there's a couple of things to it, right? I think there's just a level of knowledge that I have in working with just larger sets of data and the volume of data that comes with it, right? So the way that it would actually work in an environment that is very rich in volume is a little bit different than an environment where the LTV might be extremely high, but the volume is very small, right? So it's just a different kind of like set of motions altogether, and the way that you would go about it, and having a CRM system sort of sit in the middle, like it just those all add certain levels of complication, right? And I think the other thing too is that on the lifecycle marketing front, on the consumer side, the lifecycle marketing front like usually sits after conversion, whereas on the B2B side, it sits before and after conversion. And so it's just emotions are a little bit. But what's keeping me in consumer? I think the other component to this, and maybe I'm sort of limiting myself to just a few B2B companies, is that I've just found it a little bit easier to associate myself or to understand the target audience when I have a use case, or I can actually, you know, engage in the use case that the company or the product is developing for, whether it's fintech or entertainment, or and the thing is, like, it's true also for B2B, right? Like I use Notion, I use Calendly, and some of these other, I use Slack, like some of these other sort of B2B companies too. So I think I think that's probably what's kept me in this space.
I love that. I haven't thought of it in that context before. But I like it. Yeah. It's always a hard thing too, like when you are kind of not the target audience, but like your use case to like take your personal biases out of it. But I do feel like it makes you a stronger and more interesting marketer to put yourself in the consumer shoes. And it's easier if it's authentic, right? Like I have to imagine even now you're listening to podcasts and music on Spotify.
Yeah, yeah, right. And I think that's, yeah. And so I don't know if I'm just completely sort of slicing myself away from particular industries, and not just B2B, but healthcare, right? There's certain healthcare and health tech companies that are solid, but just for whatever reason, I'm probably not the right audience for it. And usually in conversations with companies like that, I can take a sort of a very sort of academic and intellectual approach to understanding growth from that standpoint. But It's just a little bit more difficult for me to at least associate myself emotionally or attach myself emotionally to the company.
Yeah, I think it's so funny. Like we talk about product market fit so much, but there is also something like when you're looking for a new gig or when you're thinking about what projects you want to take on as a consultant, like there is this moment of like project consultant or project human being or company human being fit that like when it's right, you know?
Yeah, because I think you have to be able to connect to the founder, right? I mean, you have to be able to understand what the motivations are for the founder, and the founder's very much behind the vision of the product, right? So,
Yeah. No, that's so true. And just in closing, we ask this question of everybody we interview. We hear the term growth hack and growth hacker all the time. It's one of those tropes of our business that you're like, uh huh. But what I want to know is what is your favorite growth non hack?
so I think the reason why, like, the term growth hack, I guess, is maybe not something that I would lean towards, is because it insinuates something that is temporary and one off. And the very premise of quote unquote growth is that it's predictable and it's sustainable, right? Which is completely antithetical to the term growth hack. And so I don't know about favorite, because I guess there's a lot. I guess it depends on the meetings that I have on a particular day. But I guess the one area which I think uh, I find probably the most interesting is probably in activation and onboarding, because I think that's what bridges the gap between acquisition and retention. And that's the point where you have your potentially your largest audience for conversion. And especially in a consumer sort of situation, if you're able to get that right, the assumption is that it follows sort of a longer term consistent play, versus if you get that wrong, right? If you get that wrong, then it's okay. Well, everything becomes that much more difficult, right? And so a lot of these tests and a lot of these sort of experiments and a lot of these things that people want to learn are around what do we need to do to ensure that this customer or this user is on the right path, that now they can avail of all the other things that we are building for the product. That basically starts in activation and onboarding, which is an incredibly critical part of your LTV CAC sort of profile, which also just has significant implications to your retention rates and eventually your monetization. So that's probably my that's probably the one area I think that I find most important.
You nail that. I can't think of much that probably has a bigger impact on LTV over time. I mean, besides characteristics inherent to the product that you're talking about, but like, yeah, you nail onboarding, you nail activation, you're in a pretty good spot. Love that.
Yeah, I mean, the only other, I guess, maybe a close second to that would be like, decreasing your churn rates, but that's a product problem. That's not. I
You're like,
mean,
that's a personal product problem. That's not me.
to an extent, marketing can help with that, but I think generally speaking, that's for my product counterparts to solve for. So
That's so funny. Patrick, thank you so much for joining me and joining us for Growth Talks. I really appreciate your time, and I am going to be thinking about our conversation for a while. You give me so many threads to pull on. Thank you again.
awesome! Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us on this episode of Growth Talks. We hope you found our discussion insightful and fun. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more valuable content. And if you're excited and ready to start up-leveling your growth strategies and execution, Right Side Up has you covered. Right Side Up is a leading growth marketing agency that is partnered with over 1,000 companies of all stages and sizes to help them meet and exceed their growth goals. With expertise across all growth marketing functions, we can help you evaluate product market fit, develop customer acquisition strategies, navigate executional challenges and staffing gaps, and make pivotal decisions with confidence. And whether you need one individual or a custom-built, full-service team, we'll find you the right A+ talent. Visit us at rightsideup.com to see how we can help you and your company grow.